Picture walking through a mist-covered forest, long after twilight has settled in. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth and moss, and a faint rustling whispers through the ancient trees. You can't quite tell if it's the wind or something else, something almost too soft to hear, like the gentle brushing of silk against skin. In the shadows between worlds, long before smartphones or street lamps, there were beings who thrived precisely in this whispering hush. Once, their presence was undeniable. They filled the tales told around flickering hearth fires, threading through the collective memory of countless cultures. But now, their echoes seem buried beneath layers of forgotten lore, dismissed as superstition or mere phantoms of imagination. These were the Whisper People. So what were they really? And why did they disappear into silence? Folklorists have long wondered about these elusive entities, these shadowed figures whose entire existence seemed to hinge on quietude and secrecy. The Whisper People were not your typical mythical creatures. This might be the strangest thing about the Whisper People. They were not known for loud roars or blazing spectacles. They whispered, not in the sense of mere sound, but as bearers of secrets, silent watchers and ethereal messengers of the unseen. Unlike tricksters who shouted their mischief or monstrous beings who revealed themselves through terror, the Whisper People communicated in the breath between words, in the pauses where humans dared not listen. In many oldie world tales, they are described as slender, spectral figures cloaked in diaphanous veils that seemed woven from shadows and twilight itself. They slipped effortlessly through forests, villages, and dreams alike, never wanting to be seen directly, only sensed. A presence felt behind a sigh, a glance caught at the corner of one's eye. One ancient story, preserved by the Celtic folklorist Catharine Briggs in her remarkable collection of British folk tales, captures their eerie subtlety perfectly. It comes from 12th century Wales, a land where dense woods and misty hills keep the boundary between real and unreal thin. A young shepherd named Rhys, tending his flock near the edges of the dark Wye Valley, often heard whispers mingling with the wind. One evening, as twilight bled into night, he followed the sound deeper into the forest. There, beneath a canopy of ancient oaks, he encountered a circle of figures, tall, slender forms whose faces were veiled in shadow. They spoke not a word aloud, but the whispers filled his mind, speaking of futures and long-forgotten secrets. "Do you fear us, Rhys?" one asked without moving lips. "I do not," he replied, though his heart thundered like a wild drum. The figure's veil fluttered like smoke. "Then stay silent and listen," it said. "The world you believe is just the beginning, not the whole." Then, in a breath like the fading night wind, they vanished. These tales aren't just fanciful stories. They reveal something profound about human experience in a pre-industrial world. The Whisper People symbolize the interruption of silence, the acknowledgement that not all wisdom is shouted, that some truths come softly, beneath noise and fury. In cultivating this reverence for quiet, the Whisper People were the ancient therapy sessions of society, reminders that sometimes the most important messages arrive not in commands, but in gentle nudges to listen more closely. But why did these beings linger in story but fade from belief? In medieval Europe, especially in regions like the Welsh Marches or the Scottish Highlands, villagers lived in close communion with nature. The forests were not merely resources or obstacles. They were sacred spaces filled with the unseen. The Whisper People embodied this liminal reality, the space between the tangible and the unknown. They were like nature's version of security cameras, overseeing human behavior and environmental balance. If you respected your environment, they would remain whispering shadows, but if you desecrated the woods, their whispers turned to warnings. Alongside this ecological watchfulness, the Whisper People served a vital social role. In tight-knit rural communities, where feuds could erupt like wildfire, stories of these ethereal watchers acted as medieval social workers, reinforcing moral codes without the need for harsh punishment. "Mind your words," the Whisper People seem to say, "for even the softest speech can ripple through the world." But the whispers were not always benign. Sometimes, the stories warned, the Whisper People could lead you astray if you were not careful. A cautionary tale from 15th century Norway tells of a young woman named Ingrid, who, tempted by the alluring silence of an icy glen, followed the whispering voices into the forest. Entranced, she wandered until she was lost to her people, found days later hollow-eyed and mute, her voice forever taken by the whisperers. Such tales underscored the fragility of human boundaries, the danger in surrendering too fully to the unknown. Yet beneath this behavior lay a deep recognition of human vulnerability and a respect for the unknown forces that shape daily life. The Whisper People reminded us that the world is layered, and not all layers are accessible or safe to explore. These stories functioned as both maps and warnings, guiding people through the delicate balance of action and restraint. As times changed, so too did our relationship with these elusive figures. The rise of scientific rationalism and the march of industrialization in the 18th and 19th centuries pushed the Whisper People from the edges of consciousness into obscurity. With factories replacing forests and telegraphs replacing whispered messages, society lost its patience with such quiet mysteries. The Whisper People were dismissed as mere superstition, relics of a naive age when every rustle was a sign and every shadow a story. Modern parallels abound, despite this loss. The functions once embodied by the Whisper People appear today in the hushed halls of therapy, where silence holds power and the unspoken carries weight. They exist in the realm of environmental activism, those original environmental activists who reminded us to tread lightly and listen to the land. And in our digital age, they echo, though warped, as the invisible algorithms and curated feeds that whisper suggestions, nudging our behaviors in subtle ways we barely perceive. But the Whisper People were more than just nature's stealthy guardians or societal caretakers. The stories tell us something else. They embody a crucial human truth, that some mysteries must be honored rather than solved, that silence can speak louder than noise, and that sometimes the most profound connections are those felt but not seen. This reveals something deeper about our collective psyche, a yearning for something beyond the visible, beyond the mundane, a liminal space where the borders between the self and the world blur. Imagine for a moment the cold dampness of those deep forests, the smell of decaying leaves mixing with fresh pine, the slow dance of shadows cast by a single flickering lantern. Feel the weight of silence pressing in, not as emptiness but as fullness, an attentive presence waiting to be acknowledged. This is the threshold where the Whisper People live, not in the clamorous spotlights of our modern life, but in the softening glow of twilight and hush. And if that sounds almost too mystical, consider this. In every era, cultures have created these whispering spirits to remind themselves of limits. In 17th century Japan, the Kodama, tree spirits, were said to whisper through the leaves, warning that to fell a sacred tree without permission would doom the woodcutter. Far across the globe, the Muisca people of Colombia revered the Guatavita spirits, whose whispered songs were believed to guide travelers safely through treacherous mountain paths. These beings, like the Whisper People, were the soul's advocates, holding human beings accountable to something greater, something unseen. But there is yet another layer to their story, one almost too startling to believe. Oral traditions recorded by ethnographers in the 19th century, such as the works of Franz Boas and John Matthews, hint that the Whisper People might not be purely symbolic at all. They could represent ancestral memories of ancient humanoid societies who lived in harmony with natural forces beyond our comprehension. The whispers in this light are not just metaphors but may preserve faint, encrypted remnants of a primeval language, one of empathy, subtlety, and silent ritual. If this sounds like science fiction, it is no surprise. The human mind has long been tangled in the web of what can be seen and heard versus what must be sensed and intuited. These tales persist in our collective unconscious because they address something we have forgotten, that the world has many voices and most speak quietly. Yet the Whisper People faded, buried beneath the noise of modern progress and the glare of relentless technology. What we lost was not just the creatures themselves, but the space for silence in our lives, the patience to wait for whispers instead of shouting over the din. But there's more to this story, and it lies in the most unlikely of places, the very heart of contemporary urban legends and ghost stories, where the spirit of the Whisper People survives, cloaked in new forms, urging us still to listen amidst chaos. And as we begin to rediscover this buried truth, we begin to realize that in honoring the whispers, we honor the forgotten parts of ourselves, the mysterious, the quiet, the unseen. So let us turn the page, step deeper into the stories, and trace the path where shadows speak and silence holds secrets waiting to be heard. Now, imagine the night thickening around you as the forest's breath deepens, folding you into its ancient hush. The whispers grow ever softer, yet somehow more insistent, like secrets passed between old souls unwilling to fade quietly into forgotten time. But the Whisper People are not gone entirely. In fact, their story takes an unexpected turn in a remote corner of northern England during the late medieval period, a tale preserved by folklorist Edwin Sidney Hartland in the late 19th century. This particular story unspools from the crumbled village of Dunwich, where coastal fog mingled with woodland mist to create places as liminal as any Celtic crossroads. There lived a young woman named Elaine, who was renowned for her sharp wit and kindness, but also for the peculiar way she sometimes spoke, her voice barely above a breath, as though she feared disturbing something invisible. One autumn night, as the village lay blanketed in restless sleep, Elaine ventured toward the ancient wood that bordered the dunes. She was drawn by a sound both strange and mesmerizing, a chorus of quiet voices weaving through the trees, calling her softly by name. The wind did not carry the sound, yet it moved like a chorus of sighs threading through branches. As Elaine stepped beneath the canopy, the whispers coalesced into figures, tall, slender beings wrapped in shifting veils of shadow and moonlight. Their faces were blurred, neither fully human nor entirely otherworldly. The tallest among them extended a hand, inviting Elaine into their circle without a single word spoken aloud. "You hear us," the youngest whisper said, the sound blooming directly inside her mind rather than her ears. "You listen, so few do now." Elaine felt neither fear nor confusion. Instead, a quiet communion, as if the Whisper People were not threats but guardians of something fragile and profound. "What is it you want?" she asked, her voice a barely audible thread. "Balance," came the reply inside her skull. "The world forgets balance. The forests fall silent where once we whispered." The figures seemed to ebb and flow like mist, merging with shadows and moonbeams. "You will be our voice, but only in silence." Before Elaine could respond, she found herself alone once more beneath rustling leaves. Yet the whispers persisted, not loud enough for others to hear, but clearly forever inside her mind. The villagers later noticed a change. Elaine's words became sparse, her gaze distant but calm. She would gather children at twilight and pass down stories not spoken, but shared through silent understanding and reverence for the unseen. This tale from Dunwich reveals something crucial. The Whisper People were less flesh or ghost, and more an embodiment of the sacred silence necessary to preserve communal memory and respect for nature's delicate rhythms. They existed not only to frighten or enchant, but to tether human consciousness to the unseen forces that nurture life. This is why their whispers are not commands but subtle promptings, the softest breath upon a still pond, reminding us to reflect before we act. But beyond their ecological and social roles, the Whisper People also serve as archetypes of human psychological experience. The soft, veiled figures symbolize the internal voices that guide restraint, empathy, and quiet wisdom. As psychologist Carl Jung might suggest, they act as messengers from the collective unconscious, reminding individuals that not all knowledge must be boisterously proclaimed. In an age where silence was a currency of respect and depth, these beings held a mirror to our own inner worlds, our fears, hopes, and the fragile spaces between thought and expression. Yet this delicate balance began to wobble as the world changed. The rise of the printing press, the scientific revolution, and later, industrialization flooded society with noise, both literal and ideological. As towns grew, forests shrank, and lifeways shifted, the Whisper People became harder to perceive. The veils of shadow they wore were ripped away by progress's relentless illumination. Where once people would pause and listen for whispers at twilight, they now sought certainty in blazing street lamps and loud proclamations. Still, echoes remain. In early 20th century Appalachia, folklorist Vance Randolph recorded stories of the still folk, shadowy, quiet entities deeply connected to the mountains and their hidden springs. Long after belief had ebbed, the stories persisted in local memory, hinting that even when a collective culture turns its back, the whisper lingers at the edges, folded in lullabies and bedtime tales, waiting for ears willing to receive. And what of the modern world? Where do the Whisper People now exist, if not in ancient forests or village hearths? They have shifted form but not vanished. In contemporary urban environments, Their spirit inhabits the technology that silently shapes our lives, the algorithms that whisper suggestions just beneath awareness, shaping desires and decisions with subtlety rather than force. Consider the way a social media feed gently nudges you toward one article or video over another, or how targeted advertising anticipates needs you barely recognize yourself. These invisible currents guide behavior quietly, often unnoticed, echoing the ancient function of the whisper people as unseen influencers of human conduct. Like them, these digital whisperers operate at the threshold of consciousness, influencing without direct command. But there is a darker side to this modern incarnation. Just as the whisper people in old tales sometimes led the unwary astray, like Ingrid in that 15th century Norwegian story, the digital whispers can mislead as well. Manipulation, loss of privacy, and isolation lurk behind the subtle shifts in thought and mood engineered by unseen forces. The soft voices of today carry the same warning. Be vigilant not to lose yourself in the seductive silence. This duality teaches us an enduring lesson. The whisper people are neither wholly guardian nor menace, but emissaries of liminality, the sacred threshold between knowing and not knowing, silence and sound, conscious and unconscious. Their presence demands humility, attentiveness, and a willingness to embrace mystery rather than conquer it. But perhaps the greatest loss modern society faces is not the disappearance of these beings themselves, but the vanishing of the silence and reverence they embody. When was the last time you truly listened to a moment of quiet, free of distraction, free of constant input? When did we last allow mystery to linger without demanding immediate explanation? There is a forgotten wisdom in this, one that the whisper people remind us of again and again through these tales. Sometimes, the most important truths are the ones we only hear when we stop speaking. As we close this journey into the buried truth of the whisper people, consider this. These beings were guardians of more than just forests or social order. They were guardians of the spaces within ourselves, the places where silence holds power, where empathy grows, and where the unseen connects us to a larger world. The ancient stories persist because they meet an unfulfilled need, a longing to live with greater balance, to honor the quiet, and to recognize that not all knowledge is loud and obvious. In reviving the whisper people in our imagination, we reclaim a fragment of that ancient dialogue, a conversation between humanity and the world that whispered softly before the noise took over. So as you go forward, I invite you to listen for those whispers still threading through your days. The subtle nudges from nature, from intuition, from the moments between words. In honoring the whispers, you honor the forgotten parts of yourself, the mysterious, the gentle, the profound. In the end, the whisper people remind us that life's deepest truths often dwell not in the clamor of certainty, but in the quiet spaces where silence speaks. And perhaps, if we learn to listen again, their voices will guide us back to a world where wonder and reverence are not buried, but alive, whispering in the breeze, waiting to be heard once more.